It's all. So I'll just put a very brief context on and introduce you to the audience here, and then I'll just pass on the entire session for your valuable insights. So good morning again, Mr. Ashish, and good afternoon to all my colleagues present in the auditorium, and also who have joined virtually for today's session. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Mr. Aashish Chandorkar for today's session. And thank you, Mr. Ashish, especially for you, because I think it's very, very early morning for you at Geneva, even though it's a very kind of a rainy afternoon in Mumbai. So we are really thankful for you to really spend and really take out time from your busy schedule and share your insights on a very important topic, which is very relevant for all of us, which will be evolving global trade trends with all of us today. So I'm assuming that you would have read the LinkedIn profile that we would have shared of Mr. Ashish already with all of you, but just to reiterate and just give a brief context in terms of who the speaker is. So if you see even on the slide, which is very much visible on the screens as well, that Mr. Ashish actually is posted at the Indian mission at World Trade Organization since September 2021, which is also the HQ for WTO in Geneva. Overall, he has 21 plus years of experience prior to his current posting at WTO, and he has been doing like a lot of various roles and also diversity in terms of, let's say, leading a lot of other activities. Just to sum it up, he has been an entrepreneur in the digital world, helping build and scale enablers for India booming technology. He has been driving a lot of digital marketing for Indian startups, helping them design optimal digital media strategies. I'm not sure like how many actually have heard his podcast, which is Bharat Varta. So he has been really involved in developing this particular podcast, which is the fastest growing podcast platform, bringing to life informed and long form discussions on issues of policies, politics, and culture. He has held senior positions with big organizations like Capgemini, Cognizant, where he had been advising top tier clients across industries and across multiple geographies. Further, he has worked on a lot of advisory assignments with some of the large corporations globally. He is also the founder and director for SMAHI Foundation, which is focusing on studying public policy, doing research at the intersection of governance, entrepreneurship, and technology. From a background perspective, he is an IIM Calcutta pass out, year 2000. So with this kind of an experience and a kind of a background, I think definitely it is an honor for all of us to hear him in terms of what he will bring to the table in terms of the insights that he has for all of us. So with that, Mr. Ashish, I'll pass on the entire session to you. So I request you to please unmute yourself, and we can then hear your valuable insights. And in terms of Q&A, so what we would request is that let Mr. Ashish first go through some of his insights, and then we will keep at the end towards the Q&A as well. So that will be the kind of a protocol that we follow. And once Mr. Ashish is done in terms of speaking, then we can take Q&As. So, Mr. Ashish, all yours, please.
Thank you so much, Ayush, for this introduction and inviting me to this session. When Mr. Sabyasachee reached out to me, I mean, usually these invites come from academic institutions or from specific events, but this is usually not from the corporate learning perspective. So it was a nice gesture on this part. So to invite me, we've been connected on social media for several years now. So thank you for that, Mr. Sabyasachee, for inviting. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you today. I am a lateral entrant to the government. I'm serving a 3-year term here at the Permanent Mission of India to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. I'll be completing my term actually very soon in the next few weeks. So now at the back end of those 3 years. But as I said, worked in the consulting industry earlier, and then I was also setting up some of my own businesses before I moved on to this role. So the idea of today's session was to take you through some of the trends in the global trade architecture. It's a topic that actually concerns all Indian firms in general, I mean, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, where exports is a big part of the portfolio. And what I'll do is I'll give you a broader picture, not restricted to just like an industry or specifically to concerns which relate to your firm, but this will give you a broader sense of what is happening in the global trade world. That would be useful perhaps in when you think about this in the context of your own business, perhaps the larger picture could be useful. So that was the intent of today's session, and I hope you'll find it meaningful. So can we go to the next slide, please? Sure. Should I project the slides, Ayush, myself, and I mean, is that?
Yeah, that's also perfectly fine. You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah.
You may just present the screen, present your slide. Yeah, that's all.
Okay. Just 1 minute, I'll put it up. Yeah, can you see the screen now?
Not yet.
Yeah. Is my screen visible? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, in my role, I work at at the Indian mission here. So this mission is accredited to the World Trade Organization. I take care of all the non-agriculture market access related to topics, plus the emerging topics of digital trade and trade and environment related issues. So sustainability related issues. So, in some ways, the history of global trade also reflects human history itself, and we'll see why trade is such an integral part of geopolitics and the global relationships. So, what we understand of trade typically today in this modern world is what we've seen post the formation of WTO, which was in 1995. There was a big round of negotiations which led to the creation of WTO in 1995. But even before that, there used to be multilateral rules-based organization as a concept. This actually came up post the World War II when the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. were formed. And actually, around that time, also there was a very concerted effort to set up something called an International Trade Organization, or an ITO. The ITO was supposed to be the third pillar of the financial architecture. So IMF, of course, was doing the macro stability, the macroeconomical part of the global economy. The World Bank was supposed to do project-specific funding or tracking of data, indicators, all of that. While the ITO would have been the cross-border commerce related rules. And in fact, there was a charter called the Havana Charter, which was signed also towards the formation of the ITO, but because of some objections, ironically, from the US, the ITO was not established then. And what came into being was the GATT, or the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was essentially an intermediate arrangement towards a global trade linkage. So this was supposed to be intermediate or temporary, but it lasted for actually more than almost like 50 years or 40 years until the WTO was formed. Then the European round negotiations happened starting 1986, which led to the formation of WTO in 1995. Now, one thing which is peculiar to all these developments or all these milestones is that all these organizations or these efforts to build organizations happened in the aftermath of some global event. which led to a geopolitical winner emerging. So when UN, IMF, World Bank were formed, that was of course post the World War II, which is when the Western world uh, dominated. In fact, at that time, like Soviet Union and US were actually allies in the war. So when these institutions were formed, their design reflected the situation that those who had the upper hand in geopolitics also had the upper hand in the major bodies. For example, in UN and Security Council, the way the permanent members were inscribed, all of that reflected the realities of that day. Similarly, in IMF, the voting rights which US had, and so on. Even when the European round started for creating of WTO, even that was at the end of the Cold War, which was towards the end of 1980s or mid 1980s, when the US led Western bloc had upper hand in terms of their position in the global geopolitics. And WTO was actually formed only after the Soviet collapse, and this whole narrative of end of history that the world is moving towards liberal democracies. There is a single unitary system of thinking of global governance, etc. So this was also formed based on, at the end of a key global event. And the bank fund consensus, which today drives most of our geopolitics or most of the principles of global economy or commonly accepted ideas of global economy, all of that also got developed in the aftermath of the Latin American crash and the Asian crashes. So in the 90s and 1990s, most of the philosophy of how the world is governed today in an economic sense was developed. But what is important to note here is that it was developed by a few winners of that outcome of that process, and mostly that was the Western world. So the one question which the trade world today grapples with is whether trade is a byproduct of globalization or is it a driver of globalization. By which what I mean is that, let's say if two countries have great trading relationship, can they also have a very friendly geopolitical relationship? A lot of trade economists tend to think that is the case because they believe that increased trade means less border conflict, less friction between two countries because their economic interests could be aligned due to mutual dependency and so on. What has happened in the practical world though is that that notion has come under increasing pressure and increasing question, increasing scrutiny. Because when WTO was formed, we were at a pinnacle of globalization where the world was moving towards fewer borders, more mobility, more kind of a common vision of how the domestic politics should look like around different countries. But in the last 30 years since the formation of WTO, we've had a dot-com crisis, we've had a global financial crisis, there has been a pandemic, there has also been several wars and conflicts in between. And those have shown that just because you have a lot of trade dependency doesn't mean that your geopolitical interests could be aligned. What also happened was that WTO formulated some very specific kind of ideas. So, for example, WTO is the only global treaty under which there is a legal mechanism to address, any conflicts between two countries, and two WTO members rather. And this has become so embedded in the thinking. Of course, this was actually the crown jewel of the WTO's negotiating process, but also it has become almost like a common law. Countries or members of WTO are realizing that their sovereign interests sometimes get questioned in the WTO because of this legal process, the appellate body which exists, where any member can bring a trade dispute against another member, and the outcome would be generally binding. So what was acceptable in 1995 suddenly it came under question, over the years, and in fact right now because of the US objection to the way appellate body was functioning, it has become defunct. So the crown jewel of WTO has not been actually working since 2019 when the appellate process, the legal process, become defunct because of the way because of US views on that process. There was also a common kind of a theme which evolved in the trade architecture, which was that tariffs and subsidies were bad, but standards and regulations could be good or bad in a subjective way. In your industry, you would accept this you would understand this very intuitively, which is a heavily regulated industry, and there are codes of manufacturing practices and standards to be followed and so on. So standards and regulations are used quite conveniently by different countries based on what their needs are, or if they need to protect their market. But they also want to reduce tariffs and subsidies, which sometimes are required for developing countries to protect their infant industries, or for them to really protect their existing market players who may not be big global entities. So because of the WTO language and the legalities involved, I mean, the trade has become an end in itself, which is now coming under increasing scrutiny. But what is important is that this was not always the case. I mean, what we see today, I mean, the kind of ideas we see today around free trades, open borders, this is more like a global neoliberal playbook, which is a more modern innovation. But this was actually not the case all along in the human history. So if you go back to the pre-GATT days, I mean, GATT was signed in 1948. I mean, it came into existence in 1948. But if you kind of go back on how the trade influenced the world, from almost 1500 to 1960s, when the world was colonized, that colonial history was a history of trade, essentially, because all the colonial powers expanded their sphere of influence, or sphere of control, essentially to procure raw commodities or raw materials, which they could then export to their industries in their home countries, and those home countries became the industrial powerhouses of today. So trade played a big role, and I mean, the colonial history essentially was a history of trade itself. If you go back to US, the very first government of US, I mean, actually recommended exactly what they oppose, what the Western world opposes today, which is essentially the use of tariffs and subsidies. In 1791, when the first, let's say, a principal paper was introduced in the US called the Report on Manufacturers, which, by the way, is available to read even now on Google Books, etc. It advocated use of tariffs as a means to develop domestic industry. In UK again, UK of course has been the biggest beneficiary of free trade. It has also been the biggest votary of open borders and free trade, because obviously it suited their interests. But even UK has used corn laws, which were essentially laws which had tariffs on imported agriculture produce, to protect the interests of the agriculture farmers in the UK, which were essentially the nobility. I mean, they used to own land, so they had the commercial interest in agriculture produce. And UK has also used mercantilism, which is essentially imposing tariffs on, for example, they used to import cotton from India at zero tariff, but they would export. I mean, they would not, and they would then export finished goods, or like clothing, to India from UK again at zero tariffs. But they would put a heavy import duty on like they would not let India export. I mean, the Indian weavers or Indian small industry export their finished goods, which is textile goods. So this kind of mercantilism has been used by UK as well. In Germany, there was this economist called Friedrich List, who was actually heavily influenced by Alexander Hamilton. So all of German industry, which we see today, the Mittelstand, the small industry, all of that has been created on the back of using tariffs as a customs duties, as were heavily used in Germany to develop their own industry. And only when the industry developed, they then advocated removing of those duties and essentially seek open borders from other countries. Same in Japan, where the Meiji Restoration era, which was the first industrial era of Japan, again they used heavy tariffs and subsidies to develop their industry. So whatever we see in Japan's case today in terms of their steel industry, etc., which was their first large industry and which led to the creation of the auto industry, all of that was again a result of heavy protectionism which the government used during the Reconstruction days in the 18th and the 19th centuries. In the 19th and the 20th centuries in the case of Japan. And US also had, I mean, after the big crash in the US in the 1920s, when the Great Depression hit the US markets, US also used something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was a very big protectionist measure to stop US industries from collapsing. Because at that time they were worried about cheap imports from Europe. So they used these tariffs to keep the European goods away. And this is how the US car market developed. In the initial few years of the auto industry, US car makers had heavy tariff protection from potential exporters, which would then come up after World War II in Japan and later also in Korea. If you see more closer home in Asia, Korea has, in fact, Korea continued to use some of these national champion strategies, which were the chai balls. I mean, they continue to use these instruments like targeted tariffs, picking winners and losers, right until 1980s, much later than what the West has done. So even in Asia, most of the Asian tigers have come up on the back of what would today be called protectionist policies. But I mean, everyone has been protectionist at some point in their industrial journey. In Japan, post the World War II, they came up with this idea of Nihonjiron, which is called the exceptionism, or how do you become exceptionally good at something within Japan? So how can Japan excel at engineering, in the auto industry, now in the technology industry? So Japan had a very strong, it still has a very strong Ministry of Trade and Industry, which earlier used to indulge in policies like targeted credit, financial policies, subsidies, and what is typically called the register policy, which is the government intervention, in government active intervention in the economy to determine the outcomes. So in terms of helping their large companies become better, helping them become globally competitive, increase their exports. Pretty much all of Korea, Japan, and then the Southeast Asian countries which learn from Korea and Japan, all of them have used those policies. Even when GATT was actually in place. I mean, of course, some of these countries joined GATT later, but I mean, they were using these policies which were prohibited even in the GATT era between 1948 and 1995. And of course, as we know, China has used the WTO system very well. Starting 2001, their GDP has almost gone 5 times from where they were before joining WTO in 2001 and where they are now. So they really used these global trade laws to their advantage, where some of their policies, which are opaque, continue to help exporters. I mean, their export-led growth comes with a great backing from the government in terms of the availability of the credit, the ability to get market share. And I'll cover some of these emerging fights which are going on between US and China, and then China and EU. I'll cover that towards the end of this presentation. So this was what we saw was a historical picture of what happened in the past, and the main learning there is that whatever ideas or policies are considered very holy today, which are considered like that these policies have to be adopted by all the countries. In fact, the proponents of these policies have done exactly the opposite when they were growing. When I mean, the industrial strength of almost every country in the world has been developed based on very active industrial policy, and only starting 1948 and then more vocally after 1995, there was a pushback on industrial policy where the members started saying that no, the country should be using industrial policy. Subsidies are bad, government intervention is bad. However, what is happening now is that these assumptions are increasingly coming under question because the world is now seeing a return of industrial policy. So, industrial policy, I mean, there's no standard definition here, but they can refer to any government effort to shape the economy. This could mean through a range of tools, could be direct interventions like subsidies or tax incentives, or this could be indirect interventions like infrastructure development or regulatory regimes. So there's a lot of debate happening on what should be considered industrial policy in the first place. What domestic steps should governments be permitted to take without a direct linkage to their impact on global trade, and what policies should be under the scrutiny in the WTO because they could be potentially trade distortive in nature. So this is one of the great debates happening in the WTO for the last 3-4 years, and I suspect it will carry on for at least for the coming decade on what part of industrial policy should be under scrutiny in the global multilateral setup. I mean, typically what happens is that since the WTO is a treaty framework and it has got several agreements under it, uh, the domestic policies can be scrutinized to the extent that they relate to those agreements. But since the industrial policy definition could be quite broad, and of course, in many cases, governments may want to use industrial policy for development of their domestic industries, which is very logical. Uh, there's a lot of resistance on opening up of the scrutiny of all government policies in the WTO multilateral architecture, because some of them may not really be related to trade. But the flip side or the worry here is that countries like China or Vietnam, I mean, they've been using, they say that they are doing something domestically for the betterment of their domestic population, but actually those measures end up being trade distortive over a period of time. So this has been the concern of the Western world in general, who's also, by the way, now returning to industrial policy. But they are increasingly questioning what others are doing while trying to push their ideas of what their governments want to protect in their economies. So the emerging issues in WTO today are the following. I'll just cover them briefly, each of them. So firstly, the pandemic was a big turning point for the way WTO works. The healthcare security, and this is an industry which is close. I mean, this is something that is close to your day-to-day work. But generally, it is considered that WTO failed in rising to the occasion when the pandemic struck, when there was this whole discussion of the vaccine, the waiver on the intellectual property for vaccines. India and South Africa actually presented a paper on 2nd of October on Gandhi Jayanti in 2020. And I mean, there's a lot of symbolism in that because Gandhi Jayanti and then India and South Africa where Gandhiji actually also worked. So there's a lot of symbolism in that gesture that in the pandemic year, India and South Africa were actually pushing for an outcome on intellectual property waiver on vaccines. Some members, I mean, few countries had actually developed their own vaccines, but there was vehement opposition to start off. Then later on, some countries joined in with the intent to make their vaccine IP available, but eventually the negotiations just got stalled for a long time, and there was a declaration on this. I mean, there was an outcome on this in June 2022 in the ministerial conference which was held in Geneva. But I mean, the outcome was quite basic, and also it was quite delayed, meaning by 2022 June, most countries had actually started to get access to vaccines through commercial means or through their own efforts, like in the case of India. So yes, there was some kind of a decision, but no country has so far invoked a compulsory licensing type mechanism to make those mRNA vaccines in their own countries, which was a target of this discussion. But essentially what happened was that what should be the role of WTO during a crisis? Can the intellectual property which is protected through the TRIPS agreement in WTO say that the rules of agricultural trade should essentially exempt the considerations of food security? Which is that if we want to build up public stock holding for future use to distribute grains to our own population, they should not be subject to the scrutiny of WTO rules, etc. So this has been a burning issue for the last decade or so. India's point was validated, unfortunately, in a bad way through the pandemic, which is that when there's a crisis, you need food security for your population. So the trading economies are not in favor of letting countries build large food stocks, because they want the global trade to address that problem and not the existing food stocks to address that problem. Then more recently, we have had the disruptions to shipping lanes. They have been caused for different reasons. In Panama, there was the Panama Canal disruption because of low rains and water levels shrinking. In the Suez Canal, there has been the disruptions due to localized conflicts like the Houthi in the ships which are operating in the Red Sea. So as you know, the cost of shipping has gone up in the last few months. This happened also during the pandemic, by the way, where all the containers were being ported by China because China wanted to export its way out or the go down. So it was not sharing containers with the rest of the countries. So containers would go from China to the rest of the world, but they would return almost empty back to China, and China was paying for that kind of an effort. So there was a global container shortage, which if you experience any trade-related business outcomes in 2021, I'm sure you would have been impacted by that either in the terms of cost of shipping increasing or the cost or the time increasing, time of shipping increasing. Sometimes both increased also for many exporters. So all this has shown that uh, there are limits of interconnectedness. I mean, you can design an economy based on just in time on efficiency parameters, but sometimes super high efficiency may not be resilient enough to absorb shocks, which could be exogenous to your thought process when you were designing that system. And I think that has shown the limits of interconnectedness. It has also shown that rogue actors can also weaponize anything. So whether it is the availability of containers or availability of food grains or availability of medicines, I mean anything can be weaponized, and it can be used for a geopolitical leverage, or at the minimum it can be used to make supernormal profits in the time of a crisis. So I think these are the emerging issues which the trade world today is facing, and WTO, I mean, members keep debating, all of us keep debating these issues in one form or the other. Unfortunately, WTO has had a very marginal role to play in addressing any of these. So which is why the organization has come under pressure lately to show that it is much more relevant in this now. Now, let's have a quick look at what is happening today in the developed world. And I pick the developed world because these are the policies which they will not want others to use, but they use it very frequently. Even I mean, this is current policy, so this is today's policy. So US, for example, is working on something called Build Back Better, which is their infrastructure creation, program. So this is the equivalent of building roads and railroads and bridges and so on. So I mean, they are investing a lot on their infrastructure. They are also Inflation Reduction Act. Again, this is something which the name is very nicely designed. I mean, it shows that US understands how the global rules or the global perceptions work. So they designed it in a way to say that I'm addressing a domestic outcome here, which is to reduce my inflation. But actually, this is a program which helps them build self-sufficiency or what we call Atmanirbharta in the area of energy. So how do you make more EVs in the US? How do you build more solar and wind in the US? All of those questions are being addressed by the Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, China has recently, and by recently I mean just in the last week, has started to challenge this in the WTO, calling it the biggest subsidy program of all times and of human history. So that's how China has characterized this program. And it says that while US blames China for losing subsidies, it is actually itself running a big subsidy, the largest ever subsidy program to help its domestic clean energy industries. Then there's the CHIPS Act, which is around the semiconductors, which I think almost all countries are today using. In Japan, there have been localization subsidies. So government is paying companies which are exiting China and coming back to Japan. They're incentivizing them that you start building locally. So if they do that, then some part of the new capex is funded by the government. They also run a large program on domestic chip manufacturing and also on green transformation. So green transformation is like an umbrella program which is around building clean energy industry within Japan. The EU, which is obviously a very heavily regulated market, it has got something called EU Green Deal, which is essentially an umbrella legislation to address all the green economy considerations. So under this umbrella, there are several things like the carbon border adjustment, so carbon border adjustment mechanism or CBAM, where they will tax imports if their carbon emissions are higher than what the EU is producing, and if there is no carbon market in the exporting country. There is something called the deforestation-free supply chains, which is essentially they will stop importing agricultural commodities if they don't conform to certain rules around deforestation. So this is around green transition and green policies. EU has also created rules on waste management handling, on packaging design. So the exporters have to, handle the waste. Handle the packaging in a certain way. The EU will also not export its waste. For example, it will stop exporting its steel scrap to developing countries because they believe that the developing countries, the green policies are not strong enough to handle the pollution aspects of handling those waste. They are also creating something called eco-design regulations for circular economy. So Eco design is a regulation which is already live now, and you will see some impact of it starting next year, which is around how the labeling happens on almost all products which will be sold in the EU. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of these trade policies which the developed world is now using, which they say is to protect the environment, and however they are very much protectionist in nature, which is it is not very clear what environmental protection will come out of these policies. But what will happen is that the industry will at least get saved or protected for the time being, and the export competition will reduce basically in several of these new emerging industrial areas, especially the green economy areas. India has also made several measures. I mean, I'll not go into a lot of details of this, but I mean, we keep hearing this in the news. But there are production-linked incentives going on in several sectors of the economy. India is trying to build resilient supply chains which focus on trust, transparency, and timeliness. Manufacturing as a concept has come back to India in a big way. I mean, we hear stories almost every day in media around how manufacturing is being focused on, how that's going to be the next driver for jobs, what kind of incentives the government is designing for tax incentives or non-tax incentives for manufacturing to increase. India is also using quality control regulations in, more and more. I mean, obviously in the pharma world or on the healthcare world, I mean, you will be quite familiar with all the good manufacturing practices and so on. But this is also being now extended to a whole bunch of other industries ensuring that the quality remains good, so that export can be also encouraged to that process. And then there are some more foundational aspects like the National Research Foundation or the focus on defense manufacturing, etc. Typically, I mean, these are the efforts which lead to creation of IP or technology, which can be used in the industry later on in various other contexts. So a lot of the IP which say the West has created through defense R&D. So, I mean, how do you get academia, industry, and the government institutions to work closer together? Those aspects are also being addressed in the context of defense and more broadly through the National Research Foundation. So, trade is of course integral and it is key to economic growth. I'm not saying that trade doesn't have a role. Trade actually has a big role to play. India is also a big beneficiary, especially through the services trade. And I'll just show you some charts, and since you have the slide, you can go through them. But I mean, there are a whole bunch of export hubs in India. There are cities which are clusters which are very strong in specific industries. And India has the share of India's share in the global exports, both in goods and in services, has been growing up significantly. We currently hold about, this is a bit of a dated information, but about 2.6, 2.7% of the global exports would emanate out of India. Of course, there's a long way to go. I mean, there's a big upside here, but the point is that there are some good measures being taken, and India accepts that trade is important, except that we don't want a situation where trade becomes so imbalanced that our industry hollows out itself. So, good thing is India's trade profile is also evolving. There's a greater product diversification in play. There's also greater geographic diversification in play. The indicators which demonstrate concentration of market, they have been improving for India. I mean, they are showing that we are not dependent on a few big markets anymore, what we used to be a few years ago. And even across industries, again, we have the share of exports in various industries, of various industries, has also been changing in a way that the export basket has become much more diversified for India. So these are some good trends, but of course, in the context of the fact that the world is enacting new policies and regulations which are protectionist in nature, it's an uphill climb certainly for India, and we have to be really, very cognizant of the kind of rules which the world is making, so that we can respond to them and react to them adequately and protect our export and commercial interests. So that's what I had in my presentation, and we can perhaps go back to some of these points as part of discussion, if there are any questions. Yeah, I see Tushar wanting to ask a question.
Hi, Mr. Ashish. It was a very insightful presentation. Not a question, but I really wanted to compliment that this kind of clarity exists from India side, and at that forum, through you, we are able to call it out what is right or wrong in the clear language, which is very a feeling that be quite relaxing as well as comforting. Thank you for this.
Thank you for the comment. In fact, and I think you bring up a very good point. These are topics of interest to all of us, and all of us because we all work in the industry. I mean, I work in the industry for several years. All of you, see, every industry is impacted by regulations of not just your country but someone else's regulations as well, right? So, especially in your sector, I mean, for example, the regulations are very critical for each market. So, in general, I feel that the understanding, I mean, we can put up a bigger national effort and across government, industry, academia, think tanks to understand this ecosystem of what happens in global trade. I don't think we kind of, as a national effort, perhaps there's some room for improvement here in understanding these forward-looking regulations, because what EU or US does today, the impact of it will be felt not today, but in 5 years, 10 years time. So I think that is quite a critical process, which I think we can all strive to improve upon. But I mean, as a more immediate concern, like all the green policies which we see as protectionist, we have been opposing them in the various WTO forums, and we speak about them. Some of it is available also. Unfortunately, it's not an area which gets reported a lot in media, etc. But I mean, all the WTO documents are actually available in public, although not easily searchable because of poor IT interface which WTO has. But bulk of it is also available. So if someone is interested in seeing what kind of objections India is raising, all that you can search on the WTO website.
Sure. Thank you, Ashish. And I think with your efforts on the podcast and all, this information will come into public domain. And with the kind of social media reach out that we have now in India, we will have more awareness across the board. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Ashish, I'm Jubi Chandi, I'm the CFO for GSK here in India. First of all, thank you for coming, taking your time out and sharing your valuable insights in this forum. I just want to ask two questions. One is, you briefly touched upon protectionism, and it is happening everywhere, even in US, or even to a certain extent, if you think independently, India and China, what's going on investments where India has adopted some kind of protectionism. And different countries have different impact, right? So what is WHO, WTO's role on all these things? Are you trying to shape in some form, particularly for India? Is there anything you guys are doing out there? That's one part of the question. Second part is, strategically, how do you see India's export? Is showing a graph there, it's changing over years. So what's your insight? So where are you seeing more of exports going to go up, and where do you see there's a risk in the balance of trade and the export share of India for the future?
Sure. Thank you so much, Percy. Thank you for your presence for this session. Quite appreciated. On the first aspect, on the protectionism, you are absolutely right. Every country is today doing things which can be labeled as protections by someone else, right? So any policy which favors domestic capital or labor or risk taking or domestic industry, all of that can be broadly called protectionist, and in that sense, most of the, I mean, a lot of what the countries are today doing can be labeled as protectionist by their trading partners. The problem is that when US and EU etc. are doing it, or UK does it, because they were supposed to be like the free trade, the open borders type systems. So their impact becomes higher, and especially on exporting partners like India, because we have been traditionally reliant on those markets for our exports growth. And they were the ones who actually propagated the idea of open borders, reducing tariffs, reducing regulations and all of that. But now the cycle is reversed. So that's the challenge which we face from our perspective on what could be a future impact for our exports. WTO see, all the trade rules, be it GATT earlier or WTO or even FTAs which we do, see, trade rules are generally not facilitative in nature. They are in the form of a standstill agreement, which says that, okay, I'm giving some subsidy to my industry, but because I'm signing a WTO agreement, I will stop giving that subsidy now or cut back by 10%, 20%, whatever the agreement is, right? But if I have been not giving any subsidy at all, because I was not in a position to do that when the agreement was signed, then I have no future rights to start a new program, right? So the problem is that this kind of a language or this kind of a legality is not very useful when you want to facilitate something. This is very useful in disciplining. This is very useful in creating self-disciplines and ensuring that the government is not splurging money on wasteful activity, on wasteful subsidies. All that is very useful. But it is not very useful in terms of, say, promoting R&D or promoting new technologies. I mean, like, look at vaccines, for example, right, which is closer to your world. Like, there was no global effort for R&D. I mean, there were efforts in the US or there were efforts by different countries in their own ways, right? Some put up money, some put up R&D capacity through public institutions. But there was no real global concerted effort. So the trade rules have been found wanting in terms of facilitating some of these things, and hence they are unable to address directly the question of protectionism, because countries say that, well, I mean, if there's a global framework to do something cooperatively, then let me do what I want to do for my own betterment or for my own kind of improvement, of my industry or my domestic picture. So this question is unfortunately not resolved, and in fact continues to be a question, like a issue of great debate and great finger pointing in the WTO. On the second question on India's exports, again, I mean, if you see our goods exports, we used to be 1.5% of global exports. It has moved up in the territory of 1.8, 1.9. I think two things are critical here. One is that we need to become bigger exporters of consumer electronics. I mean, that is one area which is, that sector comprises typically 20-30% of global exports each year. I mean, it's an emerging market. So the bigger pie we get in that bucket, the stronger the chance that our global growth, export share will increase. Secondly, in sectors like, say, pharmaceuticals or textiles or leather, which have been traditionally been India's forte or strong areas, there we have to also go up the value chain. We've been exporting at lower end of the price points or lower ends of the complexity of the production process. But how do we do that better, which increases the margins as well as also leads to capturing market through the use of technology. Technology inherent to those sectors. I think that is something which needs to be, which could be an area of focus, and it is being worked upon, but there's some upside there basically in those sectors. So I think the path can only increase from here. Good news is that finally, there is some focus on these topics and these discussions. So hopefully, the industry and the government can jointly, bring towards favorable outcomes. In the services industry, of course, which is our strong area, 5% of global share of global exports. That continues to be a good story, and hopefully, we will see even bigger levels of exports from in the next 10 years, especially with the proliferation of all these global capability centers in India.
Anyone has any question? No? Oh, please. There are a few more questions.
Yeah, I see some hands, but I can't see the.
Sorry, I was supposed to be with the map. So there are a few more people who are just forthcoming to ask some questions. If you're fine, they'll take it, and then I'll proceed.
Hi Aashish,
Yeah.
this side. So, it's just kind of contextualizing from what you said before. I'm trying to understand from you, and when I say you, meaning what is India's take on WTO's role in the future? Like, how much significance now India puts to WTO and its future?
That's a great question, because this gets debated almost every day in Geneva, right? Like, what is WTO's role for the future? And see, interestingly, despite the fact that WTO has not really risen to the occasion during the pandemic and so on, actually 2/3 or almost 70% of the global trade flows on WTO's rules, right? And WTO rules meaning what we call the most favored nation, MFN status, all of that. So, these rules are quite useful on a day-to-day basis because the main reason is that the big trading powers do not have FTAs between them. So when they trade amongst themselves, they have to follow rules which are defined by the WTO, which is all the tariffs are based on MFN principles. There is a national treatment and so on. So uh, WTO stays extremely relevant from running the world on a day-to-day basis. The question is what next, right? What areas can WTO help on in the future? I think those are the points being debated. So we of course contribute to those discussions depending on what the discussion is. If you see the WTO website, you will see a lot of discussions around say trade and environment, sustainable development. So we have our viewpoints on those topics, which we present in various committees and various WTO bodies. But in general, the WTO relevance stems also from the fact that it keeps the lights on the global trade. And I think anyone in the industry who has worked in the industry will know that keeping the lights on is also a very important aspect of your business, right? It's not that you are going to innovate every day. That's a parallel process which happens while the business is running. And I think that's one critical aspect which is probably not very well understood, including even in Geneva.
Hi Ashish, thank you for the great session and taking out time for us. Myself Tanvi, I have just one question. So with what you have presented and we have seen in the media about the war which was going on, Russia and Ukraine and all of that, my question is how countries can balance the need of national security uh, with the benefit of open trade. So open trade has the benefit of economic growth and international cooperation, but how countries can balance national security with open trade? That's my question.
So if you go back to the WTO legal text and if you look at the GATT text also from 1948, which was grandfathered into the WTO, there were exceptions of two natures. There was something called the general exceptions and there was also called the security exceptions. Right? So that's very much part of the legal agreement itself. General exceptions referred to things like environment, public health, morals, some sectors like gold, precious metals, stuff like that, defense. Uh, the national security exception, of course, referred to the national security. Now, the thing is, what has happened in the last few years is that the idea of national security has become broader. Meaning, for example, a question to debate is that, war of course is a matter of national security, but for example, if there's a pandemic and I'm not getting medicines, is that an issue of national security? If there is a drought and I'm not getting food, is that a matter of national security? Right. So those are the questions being debated. Like US used these tariffs on steel. They put tariffs on steel and aluminum, citing that these were not related to national security. This happened in the previous US administration, where they used the Section 232 tariffs. So now the question being debated is that, can I say that protecting my steel industry is a matter of national security for me? Now you can also argue that steel is used it's a foundation industry, it is used in defense, etc. Hence it is national security. But so whether the national security is determined nationally, or can WTO panels or legal body has a jurisdiction to say that my determination of my national security is incorrect. So I think these are the bigger questions which are being today debated, where many members want more flexibility in saying that if I say that something is a matter of national security, it should be taken on face value. You cannot question why I consider something as my national security. It is my issue or my problem or my determination, right? While, of course, that's not the way. If you look at the rules, the idea perhaps was something else, which was to say that these exceptions will be used in a very, very careful manner and in very limited circumstances, while the WTO legal architecture could actually, adjudicate or share their views on what could be the reasonable use of an exception, be it a general exception or a security exception. So I think this debate is very much a live conversation. I don't have an answer to it as to which way should it lean, but I'm just kind of painting the picture for you as to where, what different kind of viewpoints here are. And in fact, the appellate body which is defunct is also defunct partly. This is one of the kind of the underlying reasons what US has been saying, that the jurisdiction or what they say should have a limitation where national determination should kind of take priority. So I think we should know the answer in the next, let's say, 4-5 years, but as the process evolves. But I mean, there's no clear kind of emerging direction today in Geneva.
Thank you.
Hi Ashish, this is Amit here, the General Counsel for GSK. First of all, many congratulations to you because this is the first time I'm seeing a lateral entry and you're completing 3 years of your tenure representing the country. So that's a great achievement and I really feel good about it. I just want to understand because we are living in a very different world today. Although we talk about a lot of sustainability, but we see in the one hand Ukraine and Russia war, US sanctioning anything that they want, irrespective of what the other organization like WTO thinks about. So from the Cold War era till now, and after having spent 3 years with the WTO, do you really feel that institution like WTO can really have a future going forward and really can make a difference in the world today? I want to understand your view on it and based on your 3 years of experience.
Sure. So thanks, thank you for presence as well. I mean, this is actually again a question which goes back to what I put on the slide, which is to say that is trade the driver of geopolitics, or is it an outcome of geopolitics, right? I think this is something which needs to be more kind of carefully debated or discussed, because increasingly, and you take any crisis, even if you go back to the global financial crisis of 2008, some of the discussions which were happening then were very similar to the discussions which were happening after the pandemic, which is that what should the global institutions do collectively. And in fact, I think all of us will agree or give an observation that both the crises, be it the GFC or the pandemic, we came out of it through national measures, right? I mean, we can criticize or praise our own governments in different countries for what they did, or I mean, in terms of their policies, but very few people will criticize or praise international organizations for what they did or did not do, right? Because their presence was actually, I mean, like conspicuous by their absence, right? It was that kind of a situation. So I think this whole issue on relevance, I think, is predicated on, I think, the goal, whether it's a tail which is wagging the dog, or whether you are the dog itself, right? And I would say that the common views are leaning towards the former view, which is that as long as these organizations fit themselves well in a purposeful role where they understand their relevance. For example, I said that WTO is extremely relevant in keeping the lights on day-to-day global trade. As long as that is well understood, and organizations are not overreaching or overstating their role in solving a global crisis, that could be quite helpful. But like it happens in every organization, obviously the people who are at the helm of it, the secretariat, they obviously want to be more relevant, right? They want to be seen or contributing to solving the world's problems. So sometimes then the topics which come up are not necessarily acceptable to everyone, but or there will be different views of what role can WTO play in solving the sustainability crisis. There are various views on it, right? I mean, there's no agreement today on that topic. But of course, there's a push by several members and also by the WTO Secretariat itself to be seen as being solving that problem. Now, if many members feel that yes, I mean, you can help in some small way, but not like you're not the main driver of this solution, that acceptance has to be built up over a period of time. If there's a mismatch of expectations, this crisis of perception and self-assessment will continue.
Hi Ashish, this is Rahul. One quick question. So China over the years we would have seen has been one of the biggest exporters for lots of commodities, right? So and we typically see from most of the things in the media, India looks more inward focused. So are there some low-hanging fruits that we can mimic China, which get discussed in your scheme of things as well?
Yeah. So I don't want to give any guidance on policy here, but especially forward-looking policy here. But I'll just say that on the point of inward focus, I don't think we should call it like inward focus in the sense of the detrimental type phrase here, right? So I think every country is evaluating what is required for them to stay afloat and stay prosperous, especially when there's a crisis in the world. So those questions are still being debated across countries, including in India. What has China done? They've done a lot in terms of using the WTO system. There's no doubt about it. They really understood the system well, and they've kind of worked around some of those provisions to their advantage in capturing the export market. Our own dependency, etc. There are some. In fact, what I do is I share 2 good articles on. This is written by an Indian Trade Services officer, Tirumala Venkatesh, on India-China trade relationship. Right. So this is in public domain. So I'll probably just send this on email, which can help you understand. What you just asked. It's got a fairly detailed view of what you want to know in terms of what China has done and where our dependencies and what can we do about it. Right. So I think these questions are very well answered. So let me share that. That could be much more useful than me giving a short answer. And this is a very recent article, like 2 months back, so very good data and information on that India-China trade relationship.
Hi Ashish, thank you very much for your time. It was really nice to hear something so macro when we are so caught up in our micro day-to-day life and basic pharma industry to be specific. This is Shilpa Shana, I look after business finance. I have a very different question, so it's something leading to last 2 or 3 questions. The thing is, it's very impressive to see that you have moved from private sector to something as WTO. So in a corporate world, the CEO has the last say and things roll on. How does it work in WTO? So how it is done to maintain the diversity of voices, the muscle power across developed business countries versus underdeveloped or developing countries. And at the end of the day, how do you see or what it takes to keep day-to-day working? Because I'm sure not all these things or debates really conclude. They're always ongoing process. And would you advise or what do you think was most amusing or challenging experience you had when you navigated between these 2 different dynamics?
Sure. So thank you for the question. So on the first part, which is how WTO kind of works for all its members. See, firstly, I work for the government of India, not for the WTO. So each mission represents the country to the WTO, right? So we represent India to the WTO, not working in the WTO as a secretariat of WTO. WTO is a member-driven organization, which means that the agenda is not set by the secretariat. This is a very important difference between WTO and other global organizations, where the secretariats are so the Director General or the Secretary General, they are empowered to decide on a day-to-day basis what they want to do. In WTO's case, the laws and regulations are only modified or only created if members want it. And there's a collective voice of members, which is that it's a consensus-driven organization. So, the idea is to have consensus, no voting basically, to build a consensus on everything. So whether you're a developed country or a developing country or a least developed LDC, you have to join the consensus based on your own kind of circumstances. So hence, effectively, everyone has a veto because even if one member doesn't join the consensus, something will not go forward, right? So it's a very careful balance which has been crafted in WTO, which is that each member has got equal rights. It's not the law of the jungle, which is the biggest guy has got the mightiest has got most power. It's not like that. And when I talk about the ultimate body, the legal architecture, that was created in a way so that any member can bring a legal case against someone else, like a dispute against someone else, right? So this was also supposed to be a balancing mechanism, that it is not that only the biggest guy can sue or bring a dispute against a weaker member. The reverse is also possible. In fact, it has happened several times. We ourselves have, as a developing country, we ourselves have brought disputes against several developed countries over the years. So in that sense, WTO architecture is a very unique architecture across all global international organizations in terms of creating this equality between different members. In terms of the experiences, one thing is that for me, these are multiple transitions. I had to work with the government, the content was different, and then the location was different as well because I was working in Geneva. So the easiest part here was to transition to Geneva. I mean, I've worked almost all my consulting life in Western Europe, so that was the easiest bit in terms of moving. No issues with that. But I mean, of course, working with the government is a very different experience, especially when you come from corporate sector. I mean, the styles of working, the rituals of working, they are very, very different. Sometimes from outside, it is easy to question or be cynical about, this is not happening, that is not happening. But when you're inside the system, you also see the constraints in which the government operates. What are the considerations which the government has to keep in mind? I think that is also has been a great learning from my perspective. In WTO, of course there's a system which is a very legal system in nature, but again, the problems that we are discussing or addressing are day-to-day problems. These are not necessarily the questions of law every day, right? So that is where someone like a lateral entry could do a value add in the government sense, that you bring in the practical perspective. I mean, you said that all of us are bogged down by our day-to-day issues of our own industry, which is true. But what it also means is that you've got the collective experience built up through those day-to-day observations, which, let's say, the international rule-making bodies may not have. I mean, the aspects of what the business faces, right? So I think that's been perhaps the lever in terms of better fitment and contribution to this process of trade negotiations. So I hope I addressed some of those questions.
Hi Sabya, Tushar here again.
Tushar, you need to allow.
Sure.
Thanks, Sabya. Hi, Aashish Munal here. I also have somewhat a similar question to what Shilpa asked. I'm also from business finance team, so probably that's where our thoughts are. So this is more on soft skills. So I'm sure that in your role you would be, going through a lot of tough negotiations with other government officials or with the WTO officials. How do you ensure that India's interests are well presented at the table and well protected? And the reason why I ask is because we also deal with a lot of internal stakeholders and we go through such situations on a daily basis. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that? And how do you? So obviously everyone will have their own ways of doing it, but how do you? Thank you.
Yeah. So in fact, I should have also spoken as in response to the previous question, which is that, see, in the government system, this is a big machinery, right? No one person decides on something. Government is actually quite participative and quite deliberative in its working. So ideas are always welcome. Again, from outside things may seem quite different, but when you see from inside, you can see that there are always ideas being discussed, debated. There are different viewpoints. It's not a very top-down process that some person says something and then the rest of the system follows it, right? The system is very much empowered to ask questions, to present different points of view. So I mean, I've used that. So in terms of doing my day-to-day work, I've used that deliberative structure. I've tried to generate my own ideas. I've tried to reach out to different people. What we could do from learning from the business is that how do you coordinate better across ministries? How do you not have the ego of not reaching out to someone, right? Like, for example, why should I only be, like, there's an issue in a given domain? Maybe I can reach out to the person through my channels, through the right channels, but not just stop in my own, let's say, Ministry of Commerce or Department of Commerce, right? So I think those are the ways in which you can contribute in terms of working the system. Learning how the biggest soft skill is to learn how the system works. How do you influence that system, right? Because this is not a corporate system. This is not a command and control system where, let's say, the boss will say something and the rest of, like 5 people will sit in the room and make strategy. Even, of course, there are, that element is also there, but the government is a very, very deliberative kind of a system where you can put up your ideas very, very freely. Use that quite well in terms of just kind of generating the universe of.
Okay, it's all done. Am I audible, Mr. Aashish?
Yes.
Thank you. The outset, our heartfelt, compliments to you. It's too early in the day there and see you could make out, and I must acknowledge, because I will not waste the audience and your time in telling that how we know each other, but the audience here must know that it's just on a WhatsApp, what you call, reach out. So he was just forthcoming and he was not even knowing the organization that I work for. And as soon as he heard that it is GSK, so he was, it was fine to come and speak, and then the date was not working out, so thank you, sir. Couple of things I've been asked by my boss to do a vote of thanks. Before that, I would take a, your assessment that how democratic way we function here in this room by now. So we are not like the typical corporate template where the boss says and others just fall in line. So you can say everybody has got a fair chance to, do that. And before that, all our senior finance leaders are here. Some of them introduced themselves, some of them didn't, and we have a general counsel. I'll start my vote of thanks with a reference to the American legal realism, that is O.W. Holmes. He said the Constitution, we all are under the Constitution, but the Constitution is what we say. Very nicely, sir, you did a context setting where you said all the international organizations, I'm not going to use any uncharitable or uncanny terms because we all understand the limitations that we all have. We have to maintain some decorum protocol. But this is such a topic which is very interesting when we do some private readings. But it has also a lot of controversies, a lot of sensitive aspects attached to it, and I think you handled it very well. And the questions have been encouraged. I've been in a very candid environment, and have been more than frank to address them. Just a couple of things. Not all of us follow WTO very closely, the developments. I remember when I was a student, I was pursuing my CA, most of us are here. 2001, the newspaper was flooded with WTO news in India. So now, that's where I developed my interest what this organization is, and part of your briefing, you told what is the role of World Bank that looks into the projects, the infra, the long-term investment, and the IMF, which is in the short-term design, like what we just had in Sri Lanka or even India in 91. So that's where IMF has a role. For the short-term facilities are done by IMF, the long-term is by World Bank, that's very clear to us. Then the trade facilitators. So we all represent a country which contribution to the global trade was the highest, and that is not Indian assertion, it is the Belgian economist who says that. So we are not getting into that debate, but today things have moved in a very different scale that where we rather, I think one of the questions was around protectionism, or you were looking which you had a bit of reluctance in calling spade a spade. Now in 2001, what happened? The Doha conference, and that's where almost 140 plus member countries, most of them they represent the development bloc, so they considered it to be out and out success because India emerged to be the most outspoken advocate of the interest of the developing bloc. See, today one of the basic tenet of WTO is to include or to reinforce the fairness and inclusiveness. It goes without saying it's not a fair world that we are living, and there is nothing. There's not many qualms in sort of avoiding that conversation, but this is not the forum. This is not neither we are this is the agenda for the day. Now you also talked about trade streams, then tariff and non-tariff measures, the quantitative restriction, the quota. We used to have fiber thing. I think 2004 they did away with. How the Western countries have. We are also a global organization, so we can't be we have to be very economical about certain things. Now, it has been quite a what you call not a very smooth journey, but we had our own journey. Then let's come to 2020, the mid of the pandemic. India goes to the WTO saying that this is my rice production, and I'm referring to the peace clause. That I think probably India, you might confirm, sir. I think India, I know it is falling outside your remit. Okay, so just to take a track off, the hierarchy of the Indian mission is there is an ambassador, there is a deputy ambassador, and there is different council headed by one of the councillors. So when he says non-agriculture market taxes, that is other than agriculture goods. So 2020, India goes to the WTO, informs that my rice production for the marketing year 18-19 is about 46 billion $, and the subsidy that I have given is 5 crores, which is little above the subsidy limit, that is 10%, so that was breached. And typically subsidy, I know you made a passing reference in your conversation, many of us may not even, I don't know, I'm sorry, I can't talk on your behalf, but subsidy, when I started following this story, I don't understand how does it work. So subsidy is generally seen to be a distortion to the global trade, and in one of your point was that certain things the Western powers they expect the global trade to take care, not the individual countries holding. But at the same time we have our own issues to resolve. Then India's stand was very clear. Then said, look, I run the largest public stockholding program. So therefore, I must be allowed what is best for me. And at the same time, within the framework, so long as I don't allow this particular stock to be traded globally, so the distortion of the global pricing gets ruled out automatically. That's number one. Number two, I must be allowed to proceed with my program to avoid any unforeseen, natural calamities or whatever. Now you talked about ICT. There are many things that, as you said, it is not very easy to see. We all know there is a trade war between US and China. But then we think that Japan and Taiwan are our friends. But if you go to the ICT agreement, though they are the people who have taken us to the this thing. But India's stand has been that we are signatory to ICT 1, not 2, if I understand correct, because they also try to ambush us on the electronic goods front. So therefore, that sense, the equation with the global powers of India in the WTO context is not very, very smooth. We all are more of indirect consumer of these updates, but I don't think any of us really relate to what the grueling time that India has to do, because we all probably, part of our studies, would have studied countervailing duty or ATMAX, anything to do with the customs duty or the anti-dumping. But nothing beyond that. You have TRIPS, like we have pharma company who understands that because of the WTO that India had to go for the amendment to its patent, copyright, even the Trades and Merchandise Act. You also spoke about the Transfer of Technology Act. Okay, as a IP, as a company, as a part of the global group of GSK, we are not hit hardest because of this regime. But yes, when they say WTO this framework will hit hard India, we all understand who are we referring to. So with these, I must conclude my observation about the talk, because I think in the given time you could cover almost all the important pillars. You spoke on the tariff and non-tariff measures. You talk on TRIMS. You talk on TRIPS. TRIMS is about investment measure. TRIP is intellectual property. Then I don't think even agriculture you covered, though it is not something which you could have. You could have said no. Then obviously the 5 policy is not there anymore. But indirectly you said that how US and you used to use those quotas to their favor. Okay, and then before I sign off, I think everybody here would remember when Indian government banned some 59 Chinese. Then China obviously took us to the WTO. And they said, how can you do this? And the Indian stand was very clear there. They said, if I remember correct, there were 3 things. They said, first of all, there is no bilateral agreement for the smartphone app between India and China. The second being, every country, like you said, there is an exemption. There is an exemption where you can have your own set of rules to if your sovereignty is under threat. Number 3, which is more of a flexing your muscles, that there has been empirical evidence where China itself has blocked a lot of global giants to enter its territory whenever they have tried to harm its interest. So with this, I think fisheries and all anyway is not relevant. We are not this thing, though India is a very, it's voice its concern against the harmful fisheries and all. As a country we are, not as a group here. So with this, I think we were coming to an end of this session, and it has been a very, the temper and flavor of the talk has always been good, and our association, obviously, though it has been co-terminus with your WTO appointment, looking forward to meet you once you are back in India, sir. Wish you a very happy and safe return to the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you.